All right, today we're going to talk about section 6.18. It's called estimating tips. This is for when we're going to the restaurant and we need to figure out how much to tip the server. So for our example today, we're going to look at Shen and his family. They go to a restaurant and the final check is $45.20. Sorry, my camera's in my way. I can't find a good spot to see it. Final check. And they had pretty good service. So how do you add the tip? And how much tip should you add? Well, in the United States, we like to rely on tipping in a lot of different situations, especially in restaurants. And the kind of agreed upon rule is kind of looks like this. A tip typically ranges from 10% to about 20%, with the typical tip given as 15%. This would be typical. This would be for poor service. This would be for good service. So for most of ours today, we're going to be adding about 15% tip. But the problem is that when we are in a restaurant, we typically don't have a calculator with us. Now, it used to be true that we would never have a calculator with us, but nowadays you often can have a phone that can do this for you. But we're going to pretend for a moment that everyone in the whole party's phones are dead. No phones. No calculators. And we must estimate. Now, this is a very good practice for using this percentage finding rule that we've been doing anyway. So we're going to be adding 15% tip onto some things, and we're going to be doing this in our heads, or at least as best as we can. Now, I am going to add some work down on the page, but the key here is that I'm not going to be using a calculator. So, for example, let's take a simple little example right here. Let's take a look at, let's see, let me find an example that I like. Okay, so for example 1, let's say that a family went out and their check came to $29.75. When we're finding the tip, the first step that we're going to do, step 1, is we're going to estimate to the nearest dollar, because this is going to make the things much, much easier for us. So my $29.75 is going to go to $30. Now this $30 is going to be much easier for me to calculate how much of a tip I need to leave. Now, when you tip, tips used to be often cash left on the table. Nowadays, though, it's often you pay with a card or a debit card or a credit card. And in this, you have to write in the tip on like this little tip line. And then you can tip a different amounts that aren't necessarily just up to $1. So say now I'm at my $30. So what are my steps that I'm going to use to get to my 15% from here? So we're going to ignore this $29.75 for now, and we're going to look just at the $30 that I've got. So I want to find an easy way that I can get to 15%. And the first step that I'm going to do is I'm going to find 10%, which is kind of part of my 15%. All right, so if I'm finding 10% of 30. There's a really, really handy trick that I can use to simply get 10%. And if I'm finding 10% of something, all I have to do is I'm really multiplying it by 0.1 times 0.1, because 10% I can turn into a decimal, which would be 0.1. And this would give me 3. And the way that I can do that is all I'm doing is moving my decimal point over. So in my head, I can say, okay, $30, 10% of that is $3. So I've got 10%. Oops, I was off the page, sorry. 10% of 30 is 3. Okay, so I'm halfway to my 15%. So I really want $30 plus 15% of $30. And I want to do this all in my head. So I can write 15% as 10% of $30 plus 5% of $30. So if I'm going to substitute in what I've got 30 plus 3, because I just established that $3 is 10% of 30. Sorry if this is a little confusing. So now I need 5% of 30. Well, 5% of 30 is also another thing I can do in my head. Let me show you the trick. 5% is half of 10%. So I can just say, well, 5% of 30 is really half of what I solved earlier, and half of $3 is $1.50. Because I should be able to do a half of 3 in my head. Now I can add this all up in my head. 30 plus 3 plus $1.50 is going to be $34.50. And this should be my total amount that I'm leaving for my check, or the tip that I'm going to leave is $4.50. Okay? Now, I'm going to do this a couple more times if I went a little fast, and hopefully this will make sense when you see it the second time. Let's return again to Shen and his family, and we're going to look at that $45.20. Now, I used up my whole page, so I'm going to start to a new one. Hopefully you saved a little bit more trees than I did. But you know me, I like to murder a good tree in the morning. Makes me feel like a man. All right, we're going to look back at Shen and his family, and we have example 2. We're going to do 45.20. All right, so step 1, estimate. Or I should say round, but same difference. And I'm going to write this as $45. All right, so remember the last time what I decided is I was going to tip 15%. And the easiest way for me to tip 15% is to break it into pieces. So let me write how that would look again. Maybe this way it'll be a little bit clearer than last time. I'm going to write 45 plus 15% of 45. Now, to do this in my head, I could write this as a decimal, and I could multiply it out on my calculator really easily, but it's going to be tricky to do in my head. So I'm going to do another step and break it apart even more. And this time I'm going to write 45 plus 10% of 45 plus 5% of 45. And I can break this apart because I'm really adding here. And whenever I add, I can kind of break pieces apart and do them separately if I want. I'm really doing more work for myself this way, but I'm structuring it in a way that allows me to do it in my head. And that's the key. Okay, so this is my key to everything, this 10% of 45. And I can do 10% of 45 because remember the rule is that I'm really multiplying by 0.1. This is really 0.1 times 45. And my rule for this is I'm just moving the decimal place 1 point over. So this is going to give me 4.5. So I've got 45 plus 4.5. And now I need 5% of 45. Well, there's no trick for me to do that with the 45, but there is a trick for me to do that with the 10%. Because 5% is half of 10%. 5% of something plus 5% of something is going to give us 10% of something. Of quite literally. So here, I'm gonna just cut my 4.5 in half. So if I think of that in my head, half of 50, if I have 50 cents of something, half of that would be 25 cents. And if I have $4, half of that would be $2. So now I have 45 plus 4.5 plus 225. This one's a little complicated for me to do in my head, but I should be able to add it all up. I have 75 cents, 25 plus 50 cents. Remember, this is 50 cents because my 5's in the tens place. I have $4, $5, plus 45 is going to give me a total of $51.75 with a tip amount of $6.75. Now, when you're doing these problems and you're writing them out for our homework, you don't have to go through this whole step, but I do want to see this step here. This is the price plus the total that you've got plus the 5%. And all of this together is kind of the step that I want to see you do in your head before you have to go through any calculators. If you feel like you understand it, then you can go on ahead. I'm going to do probably one or two more to kind of keep going. Okay, let's take a look at example 3. Okay, this time we're going to look at another check and we're going to do another set similar to how we did just now. Okay, we're going to find a 15% tip. For a check of $55. Now, this one is, let me make my 55 better. This one's going to be a little easier because notice we don't even have to round. We are already at a solid round number. So I can say, well, I've got my 55 and I'm good to go. So let's see. I'm going to do my 55 plus 10% of 55 plus 5% of 55. Okay, 55, 10% of that. All I'm going to do is I'm going to move the decimal point over. So I've got 5.5. And to get 5% of 10%, I'm just going to take half of that. Half of $5.50 is, let's see, half of $5 is $2.50. So I could say $2.75 is going to be half of that. And this is math that I should be able to do in my head. Now, many of these questions are going to ask, or some of them might ask for the total amount on your bill. Some are just going to ask for the tip. So we're going to write both on our example here. Total and our tip. Okay, my tip is 5.5 and $2.75. If I add up the dollars, it's going to be $1.25 in my money section, in the coins, the cents. And 2, 5, 6, 7 plus the one that I carried is going to give me $8.25. It's going to be about the tip that I should put. Now I'm going to add that back to my 55 to get my total check, and I'm going to do my best to do this in my head. 55 plus 8.25, well, that's going to be 63.25. I think 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, that should work. Now, looking at the homework, it looks like this part is going to be the key. This is actually going to be our answer, just finding the tip. But it is important to be able to see both and be able to use both, because in the next section we're going to be finding total bills, so it's good to see how it goes. If you want, I'm going to do another one really fast just so you can see what it should look like once you've got this down pretty well. Example 4. Sorry for the longer video, but this one's a little bit different than a lot of the math we've been doing. We're going to find 15% for a $16 bill. Okay, I've got $16 here, and I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to find 10% of 16 plus 5% of 16. Okay, 10% of 16 is going to give me $1.60. 5% of that's going to be half of that. Half of $1.60 is like half of 16, which is going to give me 80 or 8. And it's going to give me 80 cents. So I'm going to add these two together, and it's going to give me $2.40 would be about my tip. And you remember, when you're doing your tip, you can always round up to the nearest. You could leave like a $2.50, or service wasn't great, you can go down to $2. But it's important to leave a tip whenever you're doing something that is expected of that. All right, good luck and enjoy.